I had already played enough of the older Ys games to have a pretty good sense of what this series usually feels like. So with Celceta, I mostly wanted to find out why this was the one so many people seem to remember, and whether it really felt like the kind of adventure its reputation promised. And since I had already beaten Ys VII on Nightmare, I did not really feel like turning Celceta into a casual walk through the forest, which felt pretty fitting, because Celceta leans into that adventurous tone almost immediately. It opens with Adol collapsing inside a town near the edge of the Great Forest, with no memory of who he is or how he got there. That is a very good start. Not because amnesia is some genius idea on its own, it isn't, but because Celceta throws you straight into a world that already feels like it knows more than you do. You don't know where you are, why you were here, or what in this forest actually matters yet. So instead of feeling like it is just hiding answers for later, it feels like you've been dropped into a real journey through the unknown. Then the game throws Duran at you, and before long, the two of you are getting dragged into a mine full of monsters and problems that already feel bigger than a normal tutorial area. That was where Celceta started winning me over. Because early on, I was mostly asking the usual questions. Does the combat feel good? Does the movement feel good? Is the music carrying? Does the whole thing just feel good to exist in? And the answer was immediate. Yeah, it does. The movement is clean, the combat has real snap to it, and the soundtrack was already doing that Falcom thing where even simple progress feels way more dramatic than it has any right to. Not long after that, Celceta throws Eldavos at you, this giant armored beast at the end of the mine, and suddenly the game stops feeling like a smooth opening and starts feeling like an actual warning. This was still early game, so I was not playing the party system well yet. Most of the time I was basically fighting with one real character, while the other limped behind me at 1 HP, which made the whole thing feel way uglier than the first boss normally should. And the real lesson there was Flash Guard. Eldavos kept throwing out heavy slams, shockwaves, lasers, and falling rocks that all hit hard enough on Nightmare to make every mistake hurt. The nasty part was that the timing was not always on the arm itself. Sometimes it was the shockwave after it, so I actually had to learn the rhythm instead of just panicking through it. Every clean flash guard gave me a short damage boost window right after. That is what made the fight such a good punch in the face for the start of the game. You do not have much room to over-prepare, and the boss can kill you in just a few bad hits. That was exactly why beating Eldavos mattered. He did not just end the mine, he was the first thing in the game that forced me to prove I could actually play it. And once he was down, Celceta finally had room to open up. You get the town, you get quests, you get the first signs of prep, routing, and slowly the forest starts feeling like more than just the backdrop. It starts feeling like the whole point. Celceta's early identity isn't really save the world yet. It's get thrown into the unknown, survive long enough to understand it, and slowly piece together why Adol was even here in the first place. And by the end of that opening stretch, I already had the start of a real adventure. One that felt better than expected, hit harder than expected, and was very clearly telling me that if I wanted to get through Celceta on Nightmare, I was going to have to earn it. Once the opening was over, Celceta stopped feeling like a game that was introducing itself and started feeling like a game that expected me to live in it. The monuments became my real lifeline most of the time. They let me heal up, warp around, and keep pushing forward without completely killing the pace. Once I reached Comodo, the mystery stopped feeling distant. The village already felt like a world of its own, and Karna helped that immediately. She is basically your way into Comodo's side of the story. Even little details like Remnos, her younger brother, helped to make Comodo feel lived in instead of just functional. The bigger issue was that everyone seemed to connect the red-haired outsider to whatever had started going wrong there. And that is one of the first times the amnesia really works in the story's favor. Adol is not just the hero arriving with a quest marker. He looks like someone who might already be a part of the problem, and he barely knows enough to defend himself. That stretch also gave me one of those wonderfully specific ease progression tools early on, the Dwarf Bracelet. It lets the whole party shrink down and squeeze through tiny passages, which sounds goofy on paper.
My god, what the hell?
But immediately made the forest feel more mechanical and more alive. Without that extra layer, Celceta could have easily turned into "then I explored more, then I fought more, then I got stronger." Instead, it kept giving the journey tension, memory fragments, and that feeling that the forest already knew more about Adol than Adol did about himself. The route towards Selray was one of the first times the adventure really started pushing back. Even getting to Selray felt rougher than the game had trained me to expect. Misty Peak already made it clear that this forest was not going to let me pass for free, and by the time I reached the village, that is also where Ozma comes in. And he worked for me for the same reason Karna did, not because he was just another party slot, but because he made the whole section feel more specific. He belongs to Selray's side of the story, understands what is going wrong there, and joins you once that local problem turns into something you actually have to push into and solve. And that is what makes Sacred Beast Lair work so well. It does not just feel maze-like for the sake of being annoying. Once Ozma is with you, the whole place starts opening in a way that feels tied to him directly. His spear starts breaking open underwater paths. The dungeon keeps changing as you move through it, and by the end, it feels less like you are just clearing a dungeon and more like you are forcing the place to reveal how it works. And that whole Selray stretch pays off really well once Angoraboras finally shows up.
What the dog doing?
First the game throws in that giant fish chase, and then the real fight shifts onto land and becomes all about waiting for the right openings, building stun and not getting greedy while he keeps trying to clip you with nasty follow-ups. He felt like one of the first bosses that really asked whether I was willing to stay patient long enough to make the fight work. And once that stretch was behind me, Celceta started opening sideways again. The towns felt warmer, and the party finally started changing in a way that actually mattered. Because this was the point where Karna and Ozma stopped feeling like local ARC allies and started feeling like people who were willing to leave their own territory behind and help deal with the bigger problem. Karna had her reasons through Remnos, Ozma had his through the Sacred Beasts and everything happening around Selray. But either way, it was a real step up. This is also where side content started working on me differently. Early on, side quests still felt like side quests. Later, they started feeling more like part of the expedition itself. Weird weapon tests, merchant errands, material trading, and optional detours that made the world feel less like a clean game map and more like a place where people actually lived. Not all of it was amazing, and not all of it deserves equal time, but together it made Celceta feel lived in. And that mattered, because the next wall didn't hit the same way Selray did. The underground ruins were less about getting lost in a dungeon and more getting worn down by it. The enemies in there, especially the Farstatus nonsense, hit way harder than I wanted them to the point where I was constantly forced into safer play and stopping to heal whenever I could. Getting the Spirit Cape in that stretch didn't feel like a cute little upgrade. It felt like the game quietly admitting that yeah, I was going to need every bit of help I could get, and even that wasn't enough on its own. I still had to back out, do more side stuff, prep harder, and come back stronger before the dungeon finally let me through. And that's what made the whole thing so memorable. The dungeon itself felt nastier than the boss at the end of it. It had that Blighttown kind of energy, where the route and the enemies wore me down harder than the actual finish line did. At the same time, the mystery was starting to take on a more human shape. It wasn't just forest feeling dangerous anymore. it was becoming clearer that something and someone was actively pushing this place in the wrong direction. And around then, the game finally started putting faces on that idea too. Gruda was already part of the larger Celceta mess by that point, but in a way that still felt oddly controlled. He did not come off like a screaming, obvious villain yet, more like somebody important who was just a little too comfortable around all the wrong things. And the same went for the people causing trouble around him. By then, the disasters at Comodo and Selray no longer felt random. They were starting to feel like the work of actual hands behind the chaos, which is exactly why the later shift with Gruda, Bami and Geddes lands. After all the dungeon walls, the status effect nonsense, and the stretches where Nightmare kept forcing me into side content just to stay alive, the game finally started paying that pressure back in story. Not because the game suddenly dumped all the answers on me, but because it finally started tying Adol's missing past. And the nice thing is, the Highland town had its own atmosphere, its own people, and one of those very Ys editions where the game basically goes, "Grrr. Sure, here's Galicia." A tiny new party member with a massive mace. Why not? Even that helped the world feels less generic to me. At the same time, the route forward was still nasty. The approach toward the tower had those stupidly strong bears that were hard enough to turn the area into grind territory whether I liked it or not. Weirdly, that was also where the combats started rewarding me in a really fun way. Because Duran had just gotten that absurd kick skill, and suddenly even survival grinding had this dumb, satisfying rhythm to it, which was good because Tower of Providence immediately proved the grind had not been overkill. Krell Emisia was the hardest wall I hit in the entire playthrough, and that first version of the fight was the one that made all the bear bullying feel not optional. But what I actually like about the tower is that the game still was not done once I finally broke through that wall. Because beating that first version of Krell Emisia does not just end the whole problem. The tower keeps going, gives you that movement payoff with the new boots, and suddenly turns the climb into something more dynamic, while the boss is still trying to make your life worse, and by the time the second Krell Emisia fight shows up, it feels less like the same wall repeating itself and more like the game giving that whole struggle a second form. That rematch was still hard, but it was hard in a way I respected more. The first version felt like the one that forced the grind. The second one felt more readable, more cinematic, and honestly, more fun. After all that pain, I finally got to meet the figure the game had been circling around through memories and half answers for so long. Up to that point, Celceta had been building this sense that Adol was connected to something bigger than he understood. Meeting Eldil in person was the first time that feeling properly stopped being abstract. And then the game did something I honestly respected. It did not cash that out by slowing down. It sent me back into Highland, threw me into a nasty ambush with mask-powered soldiers, made Gruda feel a lot more like the actual problem behind all this chaos, and only then handed me one of the best rewards in the whole game, the Golden Wing. Not just because it saved time, but because after everything the forest had already put me through, finally being able to warp freely made it feel like the expedition itself had evolved. Once the storm clears, the whole tone changes in a way I really liked. Danan immediately feels different from the rest of Celceta. Hidden deep inside the forest, quieter, cozier, and secretive in a way that makes it feel less like just another stop and more like a place you were never really supposed to find. Frida helps sell that right away. She is not just new party member number whatever. She is a halberd-wielding knight and storyteller tied to the village's whole strange atmosphere from the moment you meet her. And Danan suddenly feels different there too, because Danan knows him in a way the rest of the game doesn't. For once, he stops feeling like the cool early game partner and starts feeling more like somebody with history he has clearly not been eager to unpack. Because by then, it was no longer just
Forest mystery, next dungeon, next boss.
Now it had faces, it had relationships, it had history that people were hiding, misunderstanding, or trying to control. And when Lisa and Sol-Galba entered the picture, one as a desperate believer, the other as this strange sacred force tied to her, the whole thing gets even better, because the story stops feeling like a distant legend and starts feeling like a chain reaction of bad decisions, old burdens, and people trying to fix things in the worst possible way. Once Highland settles down, Celceta opens back up again in a way that feels less like stelling and more like the world quietly getting weirder. And Ashen Forest is probably the best example of that. It is one of the prettiest areas in the whole game, which is funny, because it is also basically a poisonous nightmare. Frida's field ability suddenly matters a lot there, sealing off those toxic fissures so the place becomes survivable at all. And that is one of those very Celceta things I ended up respecting. Each new region gets its own little mechanical identity, instead of just being the next forest, but harder. And Ashen Forest also keeps feeding the memory side of the game in a way that started getting genuinely funny to me. At some point, I felt like I had stopped being adventure catcher and turned into a full-on memory sketcher instead. The stat rewards can be laughably tiny, but the actual memory content gets more worthwhile the deeper you go. By then, it was doing real work for the story, and once Dogi starts showing up more openly in Adol's recovered memories, it gives long-time Ys players a nice little payoff without making newcomers feel left out. Then the route finally narrows again at Frog's Inn, and that is where the game gives you Ribby Roy. And because he is the king of that whole miserable frog hideout, of course he does not fight alone. The problem is not that Ribby Roy himself is some impossible deep duel. It is that the whole fight turns into an endurance problem because his frog goons keep cluttering the arena and dragging the fight out. And once he is finally down, the Beast King's claws end up being one of those gloriously practical progression rewards Celceta loves. Not some huge combat revolution, just the exact ugly little tool you need to smash through the obstacles that had been mocking you for hours. They also quietly opened the door to one of the dumbest optional mistakes I made in the whole run. Because not long after getting them, I wandered into the area of the forest's so-called ruler, got completely brutalized, and decided very quickly that this was a problem for much later. From there, the game stops being beautiful and starts being aggressively gross. Forest of Spores has none of Ashen Forest's pretty poison swamp energy. It just feels dead. And then Mustrum shows up like some levitating nightmare fish that gets even weirder once the second phase kicks in. The first attempt went badly enough that I backed off, upgraded, and came back in a much better state. One good punish window basically turned it into a public execution. And once that boss is behind you, the game opens into the ancient battlefield, which feels exactly like it should that late in the run. Wider, harsher, and heavier. The enemies there are not elegant. They are just durable enough and dangerous enough to make you play carefully. You see the Temple of the Sun sitting at the top of the ruined capital like the most obvious, yes, this is where the god lived, imaginable. And of course, Adol and Danan immediately try to force the sealed door open with raw effort like absolute clowns, which naturally does nothing. Then the game swerves into something much nastier. Dark Eldiel shows up, completely outclasses the whole party, opens the temple just by commanding it to open and leaves everyone else behind looking useless. That was the point where Gruda and the Darklings stopped feeling like idiots playing with old power and started feeling like people messing with something way bigger than themselves. That is what makes Roos Nest such a good follow-up. Instead of going louder, the game suddenly pulls you into one of the comfiest and weirdest safe zones in the whole series. The Rue language, the hidden refuge, the old world strangeness, the fact that even the Rhoda tree is somehow part of this whole mess. It all feels peak Ys. But more importantly, this is where the story finally gives the party a proper mission instead of just another destination. Find the two halves of the Mask of the Moon before the Darklings do, and figure out how to stand against Adol before the whole situation collapses completely. And from there, the endgame actually splits in a way I really liked. Mount Vesuvio and Lake Tom's ruins. One is tied up with Remnos and the eastern half of the Mask Hunt. The other digs harder into Celceta's buried history and the sacred beasts. I went to Mount Vesuvio first. Story-wise, it makes Adol even more complicated. The memories there make it clear that part of him wanted peace, balance, and future where humans could stand on their own. Gameplay-wise, this is also where Bami finally gets her proper spotlight, and she's way too good to leave out. She looks elegant, but the fight is way meaner than the first impression suggests. The first attempt almost made her feel suspiciously manageable. Then the summons started cluttering the arena. The bigger attacks kicked in, and suddenly it became one of those fights where greed, overconfidence, and a bad camera angle all get you killed for free. But beating her matters. It's not just a boss win. That is one half of the Mask of the Moon and the first real sign of how ugly that whole Darkling mess had become for the people trapped inside it. Then Lake Tom Ruins takes the whole thing in a different direction. Mount Vesuvio is the louder half of the split, but Lake Tom's is the one that gives the story more of its historical weight. It is also where Gadis finally stops feeling like background noise and turns into a real boss-shaped problem. The memories there do most of the heavy lifting, especially once the game starts digging into what Adol and King Lefant actually were to each other, and why sacred beasts, Spardas, are not nearly as simple as they first sounded. Gadis himself was not some brutal wall, but he was fun. A cool, readable fight arriving right when the lore was getting heavier. And once both halves of the Mask of the Moon are finally in play, the shape of the game changes again. At that point, it stops feeling like I'm just wandering from mystery to mystery. It starts feeling like I'm actually carrying the one answer the endgame has been waiting for. Then, the game gives that whole setup one more great pivot. Back in Roos Nest, the Elder points the party toward the Colonia Artifact Laboratory, and Rhoda Tree hands Adol the artifact Sword Emerald, a special utility you need for taking out monsters guarding that whole route. Especially the first one, blocking the entrance to the laboratory. And the laboratory itself is such a good late-game dungeon concept, not just because it is full of useful loot, including sunstone, a peak crafting material, but because the whole place feels like the game's tightening the pressure again. Then, out of nowhere, a scream from deeper inside the building. Suddenly, the whole place stops feeling like an artifact hunt and shifts into a rescue mission gone wrong. This is where Sol-Galba comes back in one of the coolest ways in the game. Not just as that thing Lisa was riding before, but as this completely muddled, pained, confused force that barely understands where it is or why it is suffering. The fight looked manageable at first. It was not. He hit hard. The timings were trickier than I expected. And that whole pattern where the attack splits and then comes back in on you was disgusting until I actually learned it. But once I started respecting the weak points, the stun windows, and the need to burst cleanly instead of panicking, the fight finally started opening up. And when it did, it felt amazing. Then Celceta pulls one of the best late game payoffs. After Sol goes down, King Lefant's spirit finally manifests properly, and suddenly the whole running thread between him, Eldil, Lisa, and the masks stops feeling like distant history and becomes immediate. Not solved, but immediate. He tells the whole party how to restore the Mask of the Moon, and for once, the answer is not hidden at the end of another 50-minute detour. It is basically right there, which is honestly hilarious after how much running around the game had already made me do. And once that mask is repaired, the whole thing finally clicks into proper endgame logic. You are carrying the actual key to the Temple of the Sun, the one thing that can let you get back inside, confront what is waiting there, and stop Dark Eldil before the ritual finishes, and the whole situation gets even worse. And of course, instead of going straight for the throat like a sane person, I immediately turned back into the world's most overqualified Sidequest Goblin. By that point, Celceta had trained me to think that way. Even the last sidequest could still be weirdly brutal. And the best example was that ridiculous Hellbird test where Frida had to use a weapon that instantly froze whoever equipped it. Which sounds like a joke right up until the game expects you to land killing blows that way on one of the tankiest plant monsters I had fought in ages. What finally made it click was realizing the solution was not raw persistence, but basic competence. Just equip the accessory that nullifies his eyes. Stop pretending the game is trolling you and do the fight properly. Which, to be fair, was a pretty satisfying payoff after how long I had been making that quest harder than it needed to be. One of those detours at least had the decency to look incredible. A dead warrior gets reunited with his armor, turns into one of the coolest looking enemies in the game, and then dies way easier than that design deserves. Vanderoper had full Nazgul energy. The reward was nice, and the whole thing worked as a good reminder that not every late game side detour needed to become a life-changing trauma. Then I finally went back to the Temple of the Sun and dealt with Dark Eldil. And I actually like that whole sequence because it pulls off something that should feel messy on paper but somehow still lands. The fight was not some impossible nightmare, but it was big enough to feel right, strong enough to demand respect without overshadowing everything around it. And what really matters is what comes after, because once Eldil finally says it out loud, the whole Dark Eldil thing stops feeling like a separate villain twist and starts feeling way more tragic. He's not some other entity. He's literally the side of Eldil shaped by doubt, the part of him that stopped believing peace and harmony were enough and started believing humanity should be tested through suffering instead. That is where Gruda gets really interesting too, because the second he realizes Dark Eldil was not even using the full power of the Mask of the Sun against us, he basically loses faith in his own god and starts moving on his own terms. Up to that point, Gruda still felt like somebody serving a terrible cause. From that point on, he starts feeling like somebody who thinks he can outdo the terrible cause itself. Then the whole thing escalates into Ys, the recourse of the world itself. And that is exactly the kind of insane fantasy payoff Celceta needed. Not just another ruin, another altar, but a place that feels like the machinery behind reality, the laws of the world, the history of what has been and what could be, all sitting behind one final push, where Eldil has to keep fixing abnormalities just to stop everything from breaking apart. It makes the whole mask situation feel way bigger than magic artifact bad guy wants power. Now it is about who gets to correct the world at all. And before Ys had the time to fully humble me, the game managed to pay off one of the dumbest little side obsessions in the best possible way. The second I stepped in there, the last 0.2% of the map finally flipped over and handed me Master Cartographer, which is such a perfect Celceta moment. Even when reality is collapsing, the game still finds time to reward you for being a deranged little completionist. And of course, because this is Celceta, reaching Gruda is not as simple as walking up to him. Ys turns into one last trial structure with bronze, silver and gold sections, and the game immediately reminded me that being in the final dungeon does not mean it is done humiliating me yet. The funniest part is that bronze was already nastier than Dark Eldiel. The boss looked like some absurd fish-headed dual katana demon and hit way harder than I wanted from something literally guarding the bronze gate. But once I got the timing into my hands, the fight became unbelievably addictive. Flash move felt amazing there. Every clean dodge was this tiny dopamine shot, right up until I mistimed one and got folded like paper. That kind of contrast is such a Falcom thing. A boss can be harder than you expect, but still so mechanically satisfying that you keep throwing yourself back at it. And according to my own suffering, I definitely did. Silver was a different kind of pain. The area itself looked fresher and more elemental, but the enemies there were rough enough that I kept getting pushed into retreat mode just to recover, and then the boss leaned full bullet hell nonsense in exactly the way I was starting to hate by that point. At the same time, it also let me abuse flash move and extra skills in the most shameless way possible, which, to be fair, is very valid late game strategy. By the time I reached gold, I was so paranoid that I stopped being scared of the enemies and started being scared of the puzzle design instead, which ended up being the correct fear. The whole section felt less like a combat wall and more like the game asking whether I was finally ready to understand what it wanted from me. It took me way too long. I spun those damn mechanisms around like an idiot. But I also respected the fact that even here, right before the end, Celceta still found one more way to feel distinct, and the fact that the area also coughed up another sunstone in the middle of all that nonsense just made it feel even more like the game was rewarding obsession on principle. And then the gold boss showed up looking like the deluxe version of the silver one. Same general nightmare family, just heavier punishment and way more enthusiasm for deleting me if I got lazy. But by that point, Ys had already trained me well enough that I could finally force my way through it. Then I did what any sane person would do at that stage of the game. I went back outside and picked another fight with optional suffering. I had already run into the Lord of the Jungle earlier and gotten completely destroyed. So once Ys sped me back out, I tried him again after stocking up on better gear and consumables. It still was not happening. After more deaths than I want to admit, I had to accept the obvious truth. He was still too strong. So I gave up on the side revenge for a minute and went back to the real ending instead. And honestly, the thing I like about Gruda is that the game lets him become exactly the kind of loser visionary he was always heading toward. Once he gets his hand deep enough into the Akashic records, he stops feeling like a manipulator with borrowed power and starts feeling like a man trying to override reality of pure resentment. He talks about humanity like it is fundamentally disappointing, too weak, too repetitive, too useless to matter, and that the only meaningful answer is to create harsher conditions and force out something stronger. The ugliest version of the same people should be tested logic that Dark Eldiel had been circling the whole time. The difference is that Gruda does not even pretend to care about balance. He just wants to turn that philosophy into a new age of Darklings. And when he transforms into Akasha-Glyph, the game finally gives him a form worthy of all that delusion. He stops looking like a schemer and starts looking like some false machine god, like he's trying to become the system instead of just abusing it. The design is incredible. The first attempts were horrible. I went in half hoping that the main story wall would somehow be kinder than the optional one. It was not. Akasha-Glyph was brutal enough that I had to admit the obvious truth. I was not finishing this cleanly without more grinding. The whole fight is built around constant pressure, invulnerable phases, falling swords, spike volleys, column attacks, and tiny windows where he actually lets you hurt him. So just like that, I had managed to reach the point where both the optional wall and the real wall were beating my ass at the same time. At that point, the answer was not more courage, it was grinding properly. So I went back out, bought what I could, and started grinding on the strongest mobs I had access to. And once I had committed to that, the whole thing stopped feeling like emergency prep and started feeling like a full reset. Then I had the obvious thought, if this grind was finally making Gruda look manageable, maybe it would make the Lord of the Jungle manageable too. So before going back to the ending, I gave that stupid deer one more serious shot. After all that stubbornness and over-prepared bullying, he finally went down, and that payoff mattered more than I expected. Not just because I got my revenge, but because it felt like the whole grind had finally paid off for real. And once I went back to Akasha-Glyph after that, the difference was almost funny. The boss that had just been stonewalling me suddenly went down on the first attempt. It still wasn't free, and the fight was still ugly enough to demand respect. But by that point, I was so much better prepared that the wall had basically already broken before I walked back in. And once Akasha-Glyph finally went down, the game gave me what felt like the real point of no return. Not just because the fight was over, because the logic of the ending finally clicked. The imbalance Gruda had created was already tearing things apart, and now the mask of the sun itself had become the problem. Not a prize, not a power-up, a problem. Something that could not just be taken away from the wrong person, but had to be destroyed completely. Which is exactly the kind of mythic endgame turn that sounds ridiculous and works anyway. So yes, Celceta really does make you take the cursed mask to a crater and throw it in like some legally distinct Lord of the Rings payoff. And honestly, respect. If you are going to do it with your full chest. The climb there is one of my favorite little final details too. The closer you get to the crater, the more the party gets stripped away, until it is finally just Adol left at the top. No hiding behind the full team anymore. Just the red-haired idiot who apparently had to finish the whole thing the hard way after all. And that is where Phantom Gruda shows up. I actually liked Phantom Gruda more than I expected to. Not because he was the hardest boss in the game, he really was not, but because he felt like the right kind of final cleanup. Still dangerous, still able to punish greed.
This dude's on straight!
But clearly no longer the real wall of the ending. The hard part was already over. This was the last thing still refusing to die. Then the mask finally goes into the crater, the whole thing erupts, and Celceta cashes out its ending exactly the way it had been threatening to for hours. And this is where Celceta leaves me a little conflicted. Not because the ending is bad. The scale and imagery land and the final stretch absolutely feels like the end of a real expedition. But the last emotional payoff is more distant than I wanted it to be. Celceta gets deliberately vague, right when the journey had been getting more specific. So the ending does not hit quite as cleanly as the road leading into it. Still, the road is the reason this game works. Not because every dungeon is perfect, not because every boss is a masterpiece, and definitely not because Nightmare ever stopped being stupid. It works because Celceta keeps turning progress into payoff. New routes, new tools, new walls, new context, and new reasons to reread everything that came before. By the end, I did not come away thinking Celceta was perfect. I came away thinking it was messy, hostile, atmospheric, mechanically addictive, and weirdly lovable in exactly the way a real adventure should be. And honestly, that title is not exaggerating. Ys, Memories of Celceta really is an adventure.